More than 980 Russian soldiers were knocked out of action in less than 24 hours along the Pokrovsk and Myrnohrad axis. This sudden collapse turned what looked like a clear Russian advance into one of the most costly withdrawal traps of the year. Russian commanders believed Ukraine had finally reached its breaking point, yet FPV teams, heavy machine gun ambushes, and a wave of F-16 strikes with GBU-39 bombs cut through Moscow's momentum with brutal speed. The shift was so fast that the front line changed character overnight, because Myrnohrad stopped being a simple fight for ground and became a warning about a new kind of war where a controlled retreat can hit harder than a direct assault. The scale of the losses raises difficult questions for anyone watching this conflict. How did Russian forces walk into such a concentrated kill zone? Why did so many troops fall even though the southern part of the city was eventually taken? And why are analysts calling Myrnohrad a turning point in drone versus drone warfare? The full story sits inside the details of each strike and each movement as mixed units of drones, infantry, and fast jets shaped the battlefield in ways that traditional defenses were not ready to match. The coming breakdown will show how this trap was built and why it matters for the next phase of the war. Russia pushed the Pokrovsk and Myrnohrad axis with a level of force that left very little space for Ukraine to hold both lines at once. The Russian advance toward Pokrovsk moved along a logistics corridor that Ukraine had defended for months, and the pressure on this route increased with every new assault group entering the sector. Myrnohrad, positioned on the southern flank, faced a parallel push that threatened to link with the Pokrovsk axis, and this connection could have created a tightening arc around Ukrainian units stationed in the south. The tempo of the Russian movement placed Ukrainian soldiers in a difficult position because the attackers were pushing from multiple directions and narrowing the gap behind the front line. Russian infantry, armor, and small assault teams advanced block by block inside the southern part of the settlement, and their repeated attempts to widen the corridor forced Ukraine to evaluate the risk of remaining in exposed terrain. The distances between Russian elements began to shrink as they closed the outer roads around Myrnohrad, and this change altered the tactical map for the Ukrainian defenders inside the city. Ukrainian officers studied the pattern of Russian advances as the front tightened, and they identified the moment when holding the south no longer supported the long-term defense of the region. The planned fallback into the northern line came from this assessment, and the northern area offered multiple prepared positions, backup firing points, and better access for support units. The withdrawal took place under heavy pressure, and Ukrainian elements had to move through damaged streets and narrow passages that were already under Russian observation. Combat teams crossed the final blocks in small groups while covering each other with short bursts of fire, and this movement helped prevent sudden collapses that often occur when a line pulls back in a hurry. The southern zone became almost empty once the last teams crossed the hold line, and this sudden absence of defenders changed the mood of Russian troops entering the area. Russian soldiers moving into the open sections saw no organized resistance, and the lack of Ukrainian fire gave them the sense that the battle in the southern half was already decided. Assault groups stepped through shattered walls and broken rooftops and reached the first abandoned positions, and these movements fed the idea that Ukrainian morale had weakened after weeks of pressure. The Russian units widened their entry routes while advancing across intersections and open yards inside the settlement, and their spacing grew irregular as they spread into the empty ground. Some groups moved deeper into the blocks without waiting for supporting elements, and these fast movements created pockets of Russian infantry inside zones that Ukrainian forces had vacated only minutes earlier. The push continued toward the next row of houses as Russian commanders attempted to establish a foothold for further advances, and this created a flow of troops through the southern corridor. Ukrainian reconnaissance teams observed these movements from the northern line, and the pattern in the Russian advance revealed the absence of coordinated checks on the approach routes. The empty streets inside the southern sector acted like a natural guide that drew more Russian units forward, and the predictable direction of their advance shaped the next steps of the Ukrainian plan. The withdrawal movement gave Ukrainian commanders a clear view of the Russian entry points, and this allowed them to track the rhythm of the Russian approach as it shifted from careful steps to wide movements across open ground. The Russian formations kept pushing forward with the aim of capturing more ground before Ukrainian forces could reorganize, And this final stage of the push completed the picture that Ukrainian commanders needed. Ukraine assigned the 35th Marine Brigade to hold the escape route from southern Myrnohrad, and this role became the center of a planned trap that would unfold as Russian troops pushed forward. The brigade stayed behind while most Ukrainian units crossed into the northern districts, and this created two separate groups on the battlefield. One group focused on reaching safer ground, while the Marines prepared firing points inside the last streets of the south. The Marines moved into positions along damaged walls and broken courtyards, and these locations gave them clear lines of fire toward the expected Russian advance. Engineers placed light obstacles inside narrow paths to slow down enemy movement, and these obstacles guided Russian troops toward areas that Ukrainian shooters could control. Small teams from the brigade used short bursts of movement to reach hidden spots inside the blocks, and these spots became the anchor points of the ambush. The trapped side of the city included several collapsed houses that masked the Marines from Russian optics, and this cover allowed them to set up heavy weapons without drawing early fire. As Ukrainian infantry left the south, the Marines stayed silent and did not reveal their positions. And this silence made the empty streets look even more abandoned to Russian scouts entering the area. Russian soldiers approached the first defensive line without spotting any movement, and the lack of resistance led them deeper into the kill space that the brigade had prepared. Ukrainian reconnaissance teams sent updates to the Marines from the northern line, and these updates showed how Russian units were spreading out while moving between damaged buildings. The Marines waited for the Russian troops to fill the last open block, and the timing of the ambush depended on letting the attackers commit to the area before opening fire. The Russian advance followed the empty lanes that led into the heart of the southern district, and the brigade could observe the formation from several angles through drone feeds. Russian soldiers moved with uneven spacing while crossing the inner yards, and this pattern allowed Ukrainian marksmen to target multiple groups once the trap activated. The brigade used restrained fire control to avoid early detection, and the plan focused on striking only when the majority of the Russian infantry had passed the first barrier. Light infantry from the brigade held the outer corners, while machine gun crews prepared to strike from covered windows, and these positions created a layered arrangement that surrounded the advance. The absence of Russian reconnaissance drones left the attackers without information about the manned positions in the south, and this reduced their ability to identify signs of the ambush. As the final Ukrainian teams completed the fallback, the Marines sealed the corridor behind them and shifted their focus fully to the incoming Russian wave. Russian troops stepped deeper into the zone and entered a cluster of houses that still held Ukrainian weapons and cameras, and this entry signaled the moment when the ambush phase was ready. The brigade coordinated with drone operators watching from the northern blocks, and the signals from those drones directed fire toward the central path that Russian infantry used. Once the Russian units crossed the last yard, the Marines tightened their control over the outer lanes and prepared to open fire from multiple directions. Russian infantry moved in from Novoekonomikona and entered the southern streets that Ukraine had abandoned only minutes earlier. They advanced through broken yards and narrow alleys that looked silent, and this silence encouraged them to keep moving toward the first choke point in the district. The Russian groups crossed damaged fences and stepped into a tight corridor where the walls on both sides forced them into a single path. Ukrainian machine gun crews waited inside covered positions and opened fire the moment the first Russian soldiers reached the narrow passage. The gunfire came from two directions and cut through the leading ranks before they could react, and the sudden burst of fire trapped the following groups inside the same space. Reconnaissance drones circled above the block and corrected the aim of the Ukrainian teams, and this real-time view allowed every burst to land on the exact point where Russian troops were trying to take cover. Russian soldiers attempted to fall back, but the confined area left them with limited space, and the drone operators watched their movement and signaled which corner the machine gunners should target next. The first Russian unit was pinned down within seconds, yet the second wave kept moving forward because no warning reached the rear elements. The advancing troops followed the same path as the first group and stepped into the line of fire without knowing the ambush had already begun. Russian commanders did not check the route with observation drones, and this lack of aerial eyes left the infantry without guidance as they pushed deeper into the contested streets. The absence of overhead support forced Russian troops to rely only on ground-level views, and these views did not reveal the firing positions hidden behind shattered walls. Ukrainian drone operators watched the entire formation stretch toward the southern blocks, and every movement of the Russian troops showed how unaware they were of the danger ahead. The machine gun teams shifted their barrels whenever the drones identified a new cluster of soldiers, and each shift created another round of casualties inside the same confined zone. Some Russian fighters tried to hide behind wrecked vehicles, but the drones spotted the shadows they left along the pavement, and this information guided the next bursts of fire. The sounds of heavy gunfire echoed through the broken structures and blocked the Russian units from reorganizing inside the corridor. The incoming soldiers attempted to crawl toward the nearest corner, but the corridor had only one direction, and Ukrainian shooters controlled that direction with coordinated fire. The pressure on the Russian column increased as more troops entered the choke point, and the tight formation prevented them from dispersing into safer positions. The lack of observation drones meant the Russian rear groups had no idea that the lead units had already been struck, and this created a continuous flow of infantry into the kill zone. Ukrainian teams kept their fire steady and did not waste ammunition because the drone crews selected each target with clear instructions. The Russian attempt to push through the eastern entrance stalled completely as bodies and damaged gear blocked the narrow route, and any further advance became impossible. The Marines who had prepared the ambush maintained control over the entire passage, and the drone feeds showed that the Russian troops were still trying to understand where the fire was coming from. The eastern push collapsed in this confined space, and this collapse marked the moment when Ukraine gained full control over the tempo of the fight on this side of the city. Ukraine turned the western tree line near the Rivne rail line into a dense kill zone controlled by FPV teams, and this area became one of the most dangerous parts of the battlefield during the Myrnohrad withdrawal. Russian soldiers moved along the edge of the forest to avoid the open streets inside the settlement, and this movement followed a narrow strip of cover that seemed safe at first glance. The trees gave the attackers protection from direct fire, and the shadows under the branches offered space for small groups to regroup before pushing forward. Ukrainian drone operators watched this movement from the moment it began, and their view from above revealed each step the Russian infantry took as they tried to advance around the flank. FPV teams lifted their drones from hidden launch points, and the aircraft flew between the trees at low altitude to avoid Russian observers on the ground. The first FPV strike hit a small group moving beside a fallen trunk, and the impact forced the rest of the Russian soldiers to spread out deeper into the tree line. More drones entered the area from different angles, as the operators received updated positions from the reconnaissance feed, and this pattern turned each cluster of movement into a new target. The Russians attempted to hold their ground by hiding behind thick branches and broken roots, but the FPV units moved through the gaps in the vegetation and chased anyone who tried to sprint to the next position. Octocopters joined the fight by rising above the canopy, and these aircraft dropped small charges onto Russian groups trapped between the trees and the rail embankment. The explosions broke the formation and pushed surviving soldiers into the darker sections of the forest floor, and this change made them even more visible to Ukrainian thermal drones watching from above. Thermal sensors picked up the heat signatures of each soldier lying under branches or taking cover behind tree stumps, and the drone operators passed this information to nearby FPV teams waiting for targets. Russian troops tried to move under the shade to reduce their visibility, but the heat from their equipment and bodies still appeared clearly on the thermal feed. More FPV drones entered the zone and began hunting the moving signatures, and each new pass added pressure on the infantry still attempting to advance. Each heat trace showed the direction of travel, and the FPV teams repeated their strikes until the entire tree line became a continuous arc of detonations. The Russian units tried to escape toward the edge of the rail line, but the narrow exit paths forced them to cross open ground that was already monitored by Ukrainian operators. Ukrainian ground teams positioned behind the rail line confirmed that no Russian elements managed to break through the drone screen, and the western approach collapsed under constant aerial pressure. This section of the battlefield demonstrated how modern drone integration can shape terrain that once favored infantry movement. The Rivne tree line became a clear example of how quickly a flank can fall once drones take control of the air above it. Ukrainian tactical aviation entered the battle when the ground fight around Myrnohrad reached its most critical point, and the strikes from the F-16 and Su-27 became the final blow that broke both Russian flanking attempts. The first major action came from the F-16 crews, who received coordinates of the Kapitolny mine area. This location had become a key point where Russian reinforcements and drone operators gathered before moving toward the southern blocks. The aircraft climbed to altitude before diving into a launch path, and the pilots released GBU-39 bombs from a distance that kept them outside the reach of Russian short-range weapons. The bombs traveled toward the mine complex with high precision, and the strike hit the cluster of buildings used by Russian units as a staging point for infantry and drone teams. The explosion spread across the yard, where equipment had been parked in rows, and the fireball forced the remaining Russian forces in the area to abandon their attempt to send support toward the Myrnohrad corridor. The loss of this position immediately reduced the number of drones available to Russian operators, and the absence of drone support left their infantry exposed while they continued to push into the trap on the ground. Drone feeds from Ukrainian teams watching the sector showed that movement inside the Kapitolny area came to a complete stop, and the silence in the aftermath confirmed that the strike had removed an entire layer of Russian coordination. As the F-16 mission concluded, Ukrainian commanders prepared a second strike aimed at cutting the Western attempt to isolate the retreating units. Two Su-27 fighters approached the contested zone at low altitude and changed their path only moments before releasing their JDAM munitions. The target was a building that Russian groups had turned into a staging room for blocking Ukrainian withdrawal routes, and this structure sat between the forest line and the edge of the settlement. The JDAMs struck the building from an angle that bypassed Russian air defense launchers positioned farther west, and the force of the blast collapsed the upper floors while sending debris across the surrounding field. The Russian troops inside had been preparing to move toward the corridor used by Ukrainian ground units, and the destruction of the building removed the last organized group capable of closing the escape line. Ukrainian reconnaissance teams confirmed that no surviving Russian elements remained in the immediate area. The two airstrikes formed a coordinated action that hit Russian forces on both sides of the withdrawal corridor, and the timing of the attacks prevented any attempt to repair the damage or send new formations into the fight. Russian units that had advanced deep into the southern half of Myrnohrad found themselves unable to call for support from the Kapitolny sector, and the lack of reinforcement weakened their ability to reorganize under fire. The Russian Western Group, which had tried to maneuver through the Rivne tree line, also lost the structure that linked their movement to the rest of the assault force. The combined effect of the airstrikes left the Russian troops on the ground isolated, and the Ukrainian withdrawal reached the northern line with the support of secure skies overhead. The wider battle shifted in favor of Ukraine, as the remaining Russian units faced heavy pressure from all sides. Russian losses in Myrnohrad stand out as one of the most stunning reversals of the war, because a retreat that looked like a collapse turned into a coordinated strike that shattered two flanks and stopped the advance in a single day. Ukraine pulled its troops out of the southern district, yet that movement created the space needed to set ambush points, guide Russian units into narrow routes, and prepare the airstrikes that destroyed the positions behind them. This battle showed how fast modern combat is changing, and it also exposed several problems inside the Russian approach. Ukraine responded with a structure that linked drones, ground units, and tactical aviation into a single timing chain that allowed each part of the force to support the others. The key question now is whether Russia can adapt to a battlefield where drone control decides movement on the ground, or whether more fights will end the same way as Myrnohrad. Pokrovsk remains under pressure, and the choices made around that city could shape the next phase of the campaign. Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you want more clear updates on modern weapons and frontline events, like this video and subscribe to Military Force.